when you're looking at Asian landscapes, to sort of follow on from the last presentation, you have to remember that not only are they different in the sense that you have this very strong concept that the world is a much more complicated place, that reality in the Western sense really doesn't have a hold on people. It's a much more complicated world with things moving in and out of what you might normally consider Western pragmatic reality. The kami that I'm always talking about, the basically spirits that live in the world we're in, live in a tree, for example, but they're really moving in and out of our reality. One of the sort of side effects of this is sort of hard to grasp. It's very true, of course, in the Hawaiian concept, and also, in fact, in almost all sort of clan-based systems where you have the idea of all-powerful ancestors, is that in that type of world, one is that people are not in a position of dominance. So unlike the West Asian religions where God makes the world and puts people sort of in charge of it, sort of like managers or konohiki, in the Asian context, as in many other societies, people are very much secondary parts of the equation. And in the Asian concept, people are just animals. We're really, really clever animals, and generally considered maybe the cleverest of the animals, but we're just one of the animals. We're not in any sort of unique relationship vis-a-vis ancestors or gods or whatever. And I think this is an enormous difference, not only in the way people conceptually see the world around them, but also when you think of things like design, the way that you're going to, if you see yourself as part of the world around you versus being in a position of sort of authority or dominance or stewardship or whatever word you want to use, that's going to really have a different way. It's going to shape the way that you view, for example, interiors, the movement of interiors and exteriors. I think this really has a lot to do with why in Asian societies there's this huge concern with the external and the internal. The inside of a house, or the inside of a dwelling or something like that, the home space or family space, is in many ways comparable to a burrow or a nest or something like that other animals would have. And I think people actually in some ways almost consciously think of it this way. And that's because that the world outside is not a world where you generally have laws. You don't have the idea that people are in charge. The world outside isn't seen as being predictable. It has all sorts of unpredictable things, some of which you can observe, others which, for example, spirits or inimicable bad things like Oni, for example, in Japan, really are entirely beyond your control. They're just part of the universe of which you are pretty powerless. And unlike the sort of West Asian concept where you can invoke God or some other factor like, say, Mary or Jesus or something like that, you don't have that in the Asian context, as in the Hawaiian, more so in the Hawaiian context. In the Hawaiian context, you could probably, in many cases, invoke an ancestor and hope something would happen. In the Asian context, you generally can't invoke your ancestors for help. They're much more neutral, I guess maybe the best way to phrase it. So people are pretty much up to their own devices. And if people are just clever animals, that means that people have to be pretty much clever all the time, or else they're going to end up in a lot of trouble. So you don't have this idea of dominance or authority. And this would make for example, when they see something like the Calvinist world in Williamsburg, they don't understand it. Because if you don't live in a situation of dominance where God has put you in a particular place that makes you better than everything else, then, for example, moving into a place like New England and just whacking it and turning it into something else really is not conceptually something that Asians would be comfortable with, and same Hawaiians wouldn't be comfortable with too. So when you think of this, this is one reason why I would argue that Asian religions and Asian belief systems tend to be highly intuitive. If you live in a world where there isn't a conception of authority, control, and law, then you have to depend much more on what you think is occurring in every situation and in your intuition, rather than assuming that things always work a particular way. There is no Asian equivalent to the 10 Commandments, for example. You can't assume a set of relationships. In the Western concept, you can sort of assume, well, you might not know what that particular relationship is. But once you've figured it out, then there's a set of rules about relationships. In the Asian concept, as with the Hawaiian concept, there is no such thing. Every situation is unique. Every person is unique. Everyone's relationship with their ancestors or things is unique. So, for example, going back to the Japanese context, going to that place in Hida village and interacting with that little shrine, or going to one of those trees and interacting with the trees in the Osaka shrine. Every individual interacts with that in their own way, and every individual is going to get their own relationship with that. There's no standardized normative component to it. Having said that, you do have underlying universals like the concept of chi and like the concept of karma. Karma, again, as I mentioned before, this is sort of a reflection of that cyclic thing. If you live in a world where things invariably are cyclic, then sooner or later, your behavior and your actions will come back to, you're going to have to deal with the result, the consequences of them, because everything works in a circular pattern. Things that you did to people will eventually come around and you'll have to deal with them. Now, that can either be good or bad, but nonetheless, the fact that it's going to come around is a given. And that's the concept of karma. Oftentimes sort of distorted in the Western view of it, but I think still there's people fairly cleverly grasp that. The other part of this is that if people are just part of the world, if people aren't in a unique stewardship relation, well, actually, if you want to take the classic example, the Western concept in West Asian religions, be Noah and the ark. God tells Noah to make an ark, you put the animals in the ark. So Noah is sort of like the National Park Service or a zoo director or something like that. He's in charge of preserving stuff because God's designated that for him. I've never quite figured out why God didn't do that himself, since he's all powerful, whatever's. In the Asian context, you wouldn't have that because people are just one of. So you might very well have some other species of animals, monkeys, for example, might be the ones that make an ark. Every individual species might make its own survival system. And so an extraction of this, also an extension of this, is that people live within nature. People can't control nature. So you're not going to have an Asian equivalent to the Corps of Engineers, for example, where you can basically reshape the world in the way that you want it to be. And, in some ways, I think it's obviously much more realistic than what we deal with, given the Corps of Engineers. But it also is a very different concept of our relationship with the world around us. Now, again, in interiors and interior design, this is going to have a whole set of consequences. One of the things that's really striking about Asian interiors is their use of wood and natural elements. They vary tremendously in terms of how they handle them. Chinese, for example, are much more lacquered or painted surfaces, but nonetheless, for example, using pieces of wood for example, for structural members that are just literally timbers, and you shape them and clean them, but you don't try to make them circular and pillar-like in the Western concept. You leave them as literally trunks of trees. You just cut them off and you use them in that way. Japanese design is most famous for this, but if you look at Chinese, say roof architecture in terms of structural architecture, you'll find that Chinese also have this very strong concept. For example, you don't use nails. You fit pieces of wood together. And the analogy for a Chinese, builder is that you're trying to build a tree. You're trying to build something that is as strong as a tree would be. So again, a very clever animal makes a nest out of the natural elements by modifying them, not trying to turn them into something artificial. So Asian design is very much ambivalent about the idea of artificiality in design, simply because that has perceived consequences. So if we look at specifically Japanese, we'll just very quickly go through these. And I'll give you first Japanese, then Chinese. Japanese design is, we've gone through a lot of this before, it's very place-based. It's very animistic in the sense that things, i.e. animals and objects and trees and water and stuff, have spirits. This is why if you go into a Japanese garden, if it's a formal garden, you'll invariably hear water, either water bubbling through a little waterfall or a stream. And most famously, probably is the little water feature done with bamboo, where a thing fills up with water and then it falls down and makes a clacking sound. It's important to remember that as in Hawaii, but especially in Asia, water is seen as actually alive. Water has mana, water has chi. In fact, that's the function of dragons. Dragons in Asia are the controllers of water. And that's why every stream, every pond, every lake, whatever, would always have a dragon spirit in charge of it who managed it. And again, these spirits are more powerful than people. So water was something that had its own life, if you want to think of it that way, and that life varied depending on where it was. So animals too. Think of the deer which I showed you in Nara. They are actually deer, but sometimes the deer are possessed by spirits. And if you're interacting with a deer, you don't know, since it looks like a deer and sort of acts like a deer most of the time, you don't know if it's just a deer being a deer or if it's some sort of a spirit in a deer sort of messing with you. And people's general attitude is, since these spirits are more powerful than you are, you're not going to poke with a stick to find out what the answer is. You might be curious, but you're not that curious. So again, this idea that people are not in a position of dominance over the world around them. Because just to reiterate, there's no substantive unified text. There is no book of Shinto. There's no book of Taoism. There's philosophical Taoist text, but there's no book that talks about Taoism. Kami, we've gone over before. The idea that things not only have life energy, but also have consciousness. So that the life energy just isn't there to be plugged into, like, say, an electrical outlet on a wall. You actually have to negotiate with the spirit that has that energy to get that spirit to let you have some. Or if you piss them off, they might give you too much. Again, those spirits can move you out of our normal reality to something else. I sort of vaguely remember the Japanese story from South Hampshire somewhere, about someone who did something to a tree, and the tree actually moved them out of the reality or time they were in and moved them to another time. So again, the idea that time is not immutable, time is flexible, place is flexible, and so reality can be messed with by non-human agencies. And last is just sort of this idea that then what you find is a lot of things that people do are tied to purification. Again, this idea of the outside world, then, if you live in a world like we're just discussing here, the outside world not only has all the people in it who aren't your relatives, so you don't know much about them. You also, and I just the point I should make here is that you also don't have the idea of psychic unity. So in Asia, as in most societies, you do not have an idea that people's brains work the same way. You do not assume that people function in the same reality. You do not even assume that people see the same reality around them. In fact, you pretty much assume they don't. So therefore, when you bump into a stranger, you not only don't know anything about them, you don't even really know how they think and what they see. So I suppose the closest parallel would be in a Western context, they'd be like a different species. So in that type of situation, going outside is very scary. There's all sorts of risk. There's rewards, obviously, but there's all sorts of risk attached to it. And because of the various things wandering around outside, you want to make sure when you come back to the home, to the nest, to the safe environment, that you get rid of that stuff. This is why, if you remember, I mentioned earlier, this is why you step over porticos to come into a house. This is why you've got the place where you change shoes and you leave the outside world, and the pollution and the weird stuff from the outside stays in the outside, almost like an airlock would be on a spaceship. And then the inside is then safe. If something happens, especially in the workplace, since that has more risk because strangers move in and out of it, but also the home, then you do purification. And this is what Japanese and Chinese do at their various New Year's. You put things up around the house, or you do things around the house to basically chase away or discourage evil or bad or just different things that you don't want to deal with, and leave the house predictable and safe. And that's that, whether it be Chinese land gods, whether it be Chinese symbols that you put on a door, firecrackers at New Year's, whether it be the Japanese various symbols that you put up on the door. All of these basic functions to basically push the rest of the world and keep it outside. So the outside is something that you have to be constantly aware of. You have to constantly be very cautious of it. And to a certain extent, the outside it's sort of ambivalent, because the outside is where you get most of your chi or mana from. But on the other hand, it's also the place that would take it. So people's relationship with the world is very, very, very complex. And this is why, if you look at, for example, since we're talking about this with Japanese design, they'll see this very complicated view of the outside and the inside. And you also see why that in many cases, and especially in Japanese architecture, certainly so also Korean, you're going to see this idea of movement between inside and outside, usually within controlled space. So for example, in a Japanese house, you have the equivalent of a Roman atrium, where you would have, if it's a decent house, you would actually have a central area inside of the house structure that has a small garden. It might only literally be 1 meter by 2 meters. It doesn't have to be large, but you put a little bit of external reality, but under your control, because it's inside of the home environment. And therefore, the inside and the outside are seen as a balance. And I should just point out as final point is the balance is really key in Asian concepts. This is also true in Hawaiian concepts also. Balancing inside and outside, balancing the amount of chi, mana, balancing, the world is a huge part and still is of Asian concepts of both survival and health. And this was one of the main functions of a house. One of the main functions of a house, especially the furniture or structures within a house, was to encourage and stabilize and give balance to people and to basically the inhabitants of the house.